want to talk this evening mostly about nutrition for performance. I want to try and keep it nice and simple. I think, and I can't remember, Joe might message me. I've got my phone. I've got to just put my phone on do not disturb mode, because otherwise that's going to keep bugging us. Right, so the plan is this evening to talk for around about 40 to 45 minutes. I could be here until midnight if we didn't put a timeline like that on here. And I wanted to go through some of the basics for nutrition for performance. The real thing that's this has been has come up across is that over the past weeks, I look at people's Training Peaks data, and I noticed there's a couple of people where as the session was going along, either the heart rate was staying consistent but the power was dropping off, or they were doing an indoor ride and we'd set a power ride for them to focus on, and the heart rates were creeping up and up and up. And so I started to question a few of my athletes about how much they were drinking, how much they were eating, how much they were cooling, to get a handle on what was going on. And I think a lot of them were getting their basics wrong. So this tonight is all about getting the basics right. Now, there is a little Q&A button. I don't know how to use this stuff. I'm just talking to you. There's a little Q&A button that I'm going to try and keep an eye on and see if there's any questions that pop up. Also, there's a chat panel. So if you feel that you want to ask questions through either of those, if you ask it through the Q&A, I will either try and answer it as we go along, or I will store it. And as we get to the end of the session, I'll probably spend 10 to 15 minutes on questions. Likewise, if people have to dash off and don't feel that you need to sit here for the next hour, I know it's a lovely evening out there at the moment. You'd probably all rather be sat outside with a glass of wine, but if you need to dash off, we hope to have this up on YouTube on the Dr. Garry Palmer Sportstest YouTube channel tomorrow, probably around about the same time of day. It might only be Friday morning, depending on how long it takes for an upload. Right, so I've done enough of the nonsense. Fire exits over there. Grab yourself a drink, and here we go for a quick rocket ride. So me, Dr. Garry Palmer, you know who I am. If you don't, have a look. Come and find me on either of the websites. That's all you need to know for tonight, because I need to spend as little time on each slide as possible. So factors affecting performance. This thing for me is absolutely crucial. If I'm working with you as an athlete, so that's our little button up here at the top, I'm working with you as an athlete, what I need to do is I need to try and get you to your competitive performance, your competition day in peak form. Now, the problem is if your training isn't going right, you aren't going to make it to competition time in peak form. Likewise, your training is going to be underpinned by you having good nutrition. So your training won't progress in the way that we want if your training nutrition isn't right. And at the moment, I'm talking basics, and I'm not going to go into any real detail tonight, but we're getting the basics right, and a lot of you aren't getting that right. The other thing is you've got to practice in training your nutritional strategy so that come race day, you know what your nutritional strategy is for race day. So we've got to get those balances and those right. Now, there's a whole lot of other stuff that we'll talk about in here normally. We'll talk about testing and acclimatization, the variety of sports that we might be working with. So even if you talk about being a triathlete, is it sprint? Is it Ironman? I don't know if our double Ironman, Dave Hathaway, I don't think he's joining us this evening. I think he said he had something else on, but I know he shared it with quite a few of his guys. So, I work with people that are stupid and do double and triple Ironman, right from someone that's starting out from a sprint event, or, someone that's doing a short cycle track race, right through to doing multi-day sportives, and likewise from runners across the board, from someone that's trying to improve, a 400 and 800 meter on the track, right through to an ultra marathon runner. Now, all of this is relevant for you guys. The key is, if you don't get, and I'm now pointing at my screen, if you don't get your training right, you're not going to compete well. But you can't train right if you don't have that nutrition right. And that's what we need to look at this evening. So we come back to my car example. If you've not seen this before, jump on YouTube, go back and look at my seminars for the last couple of weeks that we put live, or we recorded live and we've now put up on YouTube. The basics are, if we've got that vehicle that is performing at its highest level, what we need to ensure is we need to ensure that, whilst the engine is tuned in the right way, whilst your technique is good, your psychological status is good, your aerodynamics and everything down this end of the spectrum is great, weight is critically a factor if you're climbing and if you're running. So if you're climbing on the bike, if you're sprinting on the bike, or as a runner, weight is critical. The problem is, If you're sat and you've got your Ferrari parked outside, if there's no fuel in the fuel tank, it's not going anywhere. It doesn't matter. It's big, it's red, it's loud, it's fast. If it's got no fuel in there, it's not fast, it's not loud, it's just big and red. So we've got to think about that. If the fueling isn't right, you are not going to compete your performance at the highest possible that you possibly can. So we've got to work on that. So again, it comes back to this understanding your priorities. It's not thinking about how can I, get another 5 grams off my bike weight. It's thinking about your body. It's thinking about what we're doing. And I would rather, in many cases, an athlete went into a competition half a kilo overweight, but had looked after their body than had tried to strip down and have broken themselves down and broken their immune function, which brings me on to what we're talking about in a fortnight. So in a fortnight, I'm going to be looking at signs and symptoms of overtraining and potentially how to observe those and look out for them and avoid them. So it's all about priorities. And tonight, the priority is thinking about your nutrition. But we've got to put the whole picture together. So I'm going to start to scare you. Energy during exercise. Yeah, it's great. We're going to drink. Hopefully we're going to drink. I've got my glass here of... We're going to drink. We're going to try and stay hydrated. But do we need more than that? What are we doing? How well hydrated do we need to stay? What's too much? What's too little? So a little bit of underlying physiology. Typical adult male, and I don't know who's the audience out there. I saw about 25 or 30 of you on board a short while ago. That may or may not have gone up or down. Let's just have a quick look. Sorry, someone's just... don't worry, I can ignore that. Brain's gone. So there seems to be what we're looking at. Typical 80 kilo male. We have a carbohydrate store of around about 80 to 100 grams of carbohydrate in the liver and around about 300 to 400 grams of carbohydrate in the muscles. So total body store, someone of my size at the moment, 80 kilos, I've got, when full, around about half a kilo of carbohydrate on board. If we look at total body fat, it varies. And normally I'd be looking at an audience and I'd be looking around people and go, oh, we can see the differences. If something like I am at the moment, I'm 80 kilos, I'm 15% body fat, I am carrying around with me something like 12 kilos of fat. I need to be back down at 70, 74 kilos and about 6% body fat. So we need to bring that right down in order to get optimal performance. But the crucial thing here is that if we look up here, we've got a total carbohydrate store of around about half a kilo. And yet we've got a fat store for a typical adult male. Females are higher values. Typical adult male here of around about 12 kilos. So we've already got 24 times the amount of fat stored in the body than we have in carbohydrates for a typical male. That's not someone that's overweight, that's someone that's reasonably healthy. Most people look at and go, you're relatively lean. Again, scary fact, we're looking at a scale of elite athlete being around about 3 to 4% as a male, elite female athlete probably being around 10, 12%. So there's already a substantial difference. Ideal male, we're looking at really about 12 to 15%. Ideal female, we're looking at more like 22 to 26, 28%. Overweight male, we're starting to look at over 20%. Overweight female, we're starting to look at over 35%. So do those maths and you've got an understanding of how that fat to carbohydrate store ratio varies. And that for me is really critical. So if we're looking at a typical individual, typical adult male, when we look at what the energy store is, our total carbohydrate store is around about 2,000 calories. Our total fat store, because we've got twice the amount of energy stored per gram of fat as we have carbohydrate, is about 50 times. So again, if I go back to my examples here, what we've got here is got half a kilo of carbohydrate. We've got 12 kilos of fat, so we've got 25 times the amount of fat stored as we have carbs, but fat's twice the energy of carbohydrate. So we end up down here with about 50 times the amount of energy stored from fat to carbohydrate. So that for me is really crucial at this point. Now, as we're exercising, as we're running along, as we're cycling, we breathe in oxygen. That oxygen goes into the lungs, goes into the blood. muscle contracts, you go forward. Now, again, I'm going to go through the whole of this process in about 4 weeks, possibly 6 weeks time on another seminar. Hopefully, as we start opening up testing. So again, people get a much better understanding of what I do with these numbers. But trust me for now, every litre of oxygen you take in is using or burning. If we were burning exclusively fat, we'd be burning through less than half a gram of fat. That same litre of oxygen, if you were burning exclusively carbohydrate, we'd be burning about 1¼ grams of carbohydrate. So again, we've got around about just over double the amount of carbohydrate burning to fat burning, but we've already got 50 times the amount of fat stored in the body. So we've got this balance and we've got this shift in the wrong direction effectively. As an example, I've just thrown in, there's lots of running examples tonight, not many cycling examples, so I'll try and talk some cycling numbers as well. But, you know, typical elite athlete is going to VO2 max of around about 5 litres a minute. You know, as in a typical elite cyclist, you're going to be able to maintain about 80% of that for around about a 2-hour performance. So as an elite athlete, these guys are going to be running at 4 litres or cycling at 4 litres of oxygen per minute. So all of this 100 litres of air going in, they're only extracting about 4 litres of that and then kicking out the waste product. So again, we'll go back, and if you can see sort of in the shaded area here, at 80% of VO2 max, using 4 litres of oxygen, multiply that by 4, you're burning through 5 grams of carbohydrate per minute. Scale back, you've got a 500 gram carbohydrate store. So at the end of 2 hours, you're going to be completely empty. Hang on a minute. I'm not an elite runner. I'm going to be out doing my marathon for 3.5, 4.5, 5 hours, or I'm going to be out doing my sportif for 3, 4, 5 hours. How the heck am I going to get around? And that's the crucial bit that we've got to think about. Even going out for that training session over 2 hours duration, it tends to be around about 2 to 3 hours. Most people will start to hit the wall, and this is why. So every litre of oxygen that we're able to use, we've got a certain yield of energy from fat and a certain yield of energy from carbohydrate. And the body at the moment is completely stacked against us, because that litre of oxygen is only going to burn 4.7 calories of energy if you're using fat, and it's going to burn over 5 calories of energy if you're burning carbohydrate. So we've got lots of fat stored, typically 25 to 50 times the amount of fat stored in our body. As we pull that oxygen in, we burn through carbohydrate faster than fat. And actually, we've now got another problem in the fact that every litre of oxygen preferentially delivers more energy from carbohydrate than fat. And that's because of the whole nature of the way that the fat molecule is and the breakdown and the processing of the fat. So we really should know our metabolic profile. We need to see people in the lab to get a proper understanding of what's going on. And at this point, I want to go a bit scary numbers. And I want to go through this properly again in, as I say, about probably 4 weeks' time. In 2 weeks' time, I think we're doing overtraining, so it'll either be 4 or 6 weeks' time if you guys are interested. What we've got here is a typical metabolic response from someone doing a run test with me. And I pulled these numbers up about a week or 3 ago, so to be honest, I can't remember who the athlete is or what the work paces are. But what we've got here is, I keep losing my mouse, trying to use this as a pointer. So what we've got here is we've got this blue line here is the oxygen uptake. So you can see blue oxygen uptake, red carbon dioxide. At this point, I'm not worried. We don't need to worry too much about that brown line, but that brown is the ventilation. And I'm really, for now, going to focus on the left-hand side of this graph. And what we can see is when the oxygen uptake is above carbon dioxide, we've got a nice daylight there. And as the workload goes up, so I've probably run this athlete at, and I'm going to guesstimate here, 10 Ks an hour, 12 Ks an hour, and 14 Ks an hour, but it might not be that athlete. It might be someone at 9, 11, and 13. The workloads would be specific to you and specific to your training. So what we can see is when we can see oxygen uptake higher than carbon dioxide here, and shout me questions if I'm losing you. At that point, I know metabolically your body is burning fat and carbohydrate. When we've got to this point here, this third workload where we can see these two lines sitting one on top of the other, at this point here, I know that we've shut down all our fat burning completely, we're only burning carbohydrate. Now, again, I don't want to go into the whole mechanics of this tonight. That's for another session. That's not what tonight's about. But I can quite happily see lots of fat burning, not so much fat burning, no fat burning. Right, okay. On this side of the screen, what we can see the oxygen uptake line going up here, and I can see nice fat burning going on. chaps or lady has hit a threshold point here, and then they've gone anaerobic and they've lasted for another 60 to 90 seconds before hit a VO2 peak and they've stopped. And actually in this example here, the VO2 peak, the second point, is pretty much where it was at this first point. So when they're running extended at threshold, they're almost at their VO2 max, as we would call it. So that's the problem we've got, is that we can use this to look at the ratio between oxygen uptake, carbon dioxide, and see how much fuel burning you're going on. So if any of you listened to the FTP presentation I did a fortnight back, this is the point that I'm trying to make, is actually understanding this metabolic threshold, where this crossover point occurs here and here, and then understanding what's going on below it and actually understanding what's going on above it really gives us a much clearer indication of how your body is responding to exercise. So from that point of view, I've got a much clearer understanding of where you are, how you're responding, and what's going on with your performances. So I can start to use this to give us an understanding of what's happening. And if we look at the next slide, we then start saying, well, what's going on in terms of exercise? And I said to you I was going to focus on that first 15 minutes. And in this example here, what we can see is the red line here is the heart rate. So this athlete's heart rate is going up and up and up and up and up in relatively linear fashion. There's a bit of a break point here. It's not quite linear, but it's going up in a nice linear fashion. They peaked at a heart rate of around about 180. But what we can see is that if we look at the fat burning here, the fat metabolism, we're looking at how many calories and energy are coming from fat on an hourly basis, at a very low intensity, at a very low heart rate here, we can see their fat metabolism is increasing, increasing, increasing. And it's actually peaking at around about this point down here, which again is peaking at around about 225 calories an hour, which is quite a lot of fat metabolism. And as the workload continues, this fat metabolism is dropping down and dropping down and dropping down to the point that we're sort of getting down here. There's virtually no fat metabolism. And certainly by 9 minutes, that fat metabolism is shut down completely. So if we look at what's going on at this point here, and we look up the graph, we can see, well, by the time that this athlete is 140 beats a minute, with a max very, very close up here to, I've lost my mouse again, very close up here to 180, we can see 40 beats below their max. There is absolutely no fat metabolism going on whatsoever. Now, in this example here, I've not overlaid carbohydrate because it really suppresses the fat metabolism you'll see in a moment. But we can see by the time that the athlete is probably getting to this point here, or at worst up here, we can see that this fat metabolism is really, really shutting down. So, by the time the athlete is at heart rate 120 with a max at 180, 60 beats below max, their fat metabolism is shutting down completely. So, when I hear other coaches saying to an athlete, oh, this is, you're 30 beats below max, this is about fat burning, it often isn't. 30 beats below max, you are still burning an awful amount of carbohydrate. And again, I just pulled some data up. So if we look at the next slide here, again, I don't want to be too heavy on data, but I think it's really important that I get this message across at this point, is that, I've used some cycling values here, but a power output of 135 watts for this rider here, and this rider would have had a max of around about 300 watts, power output of 135 watts. I've measured oxygen uptake, so VO2 oxygen uptake, VCO2 carbon dioxide. Using these two values here, we can calculate how much carbohydrate oxidation is going on. Now that's carbohydrate oxidation in terms of how many grams of carbohydrate are being burnt per minute. So at this point here, heart rate 135, power of 135, this athlete here is already burning 2.5 grams of carbohydrate for each minute they're exercising. And although it looks like there's decent fat metabolism going on, what we're actually seeing is here, we're actually seeing less than 0.1 of a gram of fat metabolism going on. Now, most cyclists will say to you, if you've got a peak at 300 watts and you're riding at 135 watts, you'll feel like you're doing nothing. But even at this point here, this athlete has got a considerable amount of fat metabolism going on, considerable amount of carbohydrate metabolism going on, and hardly any fat metabolism going on. As we've got them up towards threshold, 180 watts for this athlete here, so not a massive threshold, but still okay. What we're seeing here is this carbohydrate metabolism now is at 3.7 grams of carbs per minute, and virtually no fat oxidation going on whatsoever. So the problem that I've got is that if an athlete thinks that they're at threshold, it's how much carbohydrate they're burning through at that rate. And actually where they think they're below threshold and they can keep going till the cows come home, if I come back to the maths on this basis here, If we've got a 500 gram carbohydrate store and I'm burning carbohydrate at the rate of 2.5 grams per minute, I've not got hours upon hours upon hours. I've not got an 8-hour sportive before I run out of fuel. So it's really important for me that we actually look at what's going on in a much more evidential based piece of information. So, so I'm going to flick back a couple of slides. Can I flick back a slide? Come on. And come back to this and say it's really, really important, if you've not done this before, that once all this lockdown nonsense is over and social distancing is over, or you've got to come and see me and I'm going to have face masks and goggles and all sorts of weird and wonderful things on so I can get in the same room with you blowing hard, we need to understand what is going on with your physiology in order to be able to help you understand your fueling better. But we can overrun that by saying this is important. This is really important. If you're doing half Ironman, ultras, if you're doing anything more than a half marathon in, let's say, hour 45, 2 hours, so that would be half marathon distance, ultra marathon distance. If you're doing anything which is riding probably over a 50-mile time trial basis, 100-mile time trial, sportive, 2 to 3 hour road race, this information is absolutely crucial that you know what's going on. So you know how much fueling you need to be looking at, you know what your training zones are, and you know if you're thinking to try and reduce your body fat down, and that's another presentation completely, if you're trying to reduce your body fat down, that you actually know where your optimal fat burn is in order to get your performance and get your training sorted. So we're going to move on. Lots of information coming through there. Just quickly highlight, every litre of oxygen that we metabolize up here is giving us less than 4.7 calories from fat and over 5 calories of energy from carbohydrate. So carbohydrate is a far more efficient fuel, but the stores are limited. And how the body makes that fuel choice is dependent on many factors. And again, I'm going to now speed up and run through a lot of stuff, heavy stuff. Right, classic studies done from 60s and 70s. Classic study one, group of cyclists stripped out of carbohydrate by doing repeat sprints and then fed for 3-4 days. And what we saw, if you were fed a low carbohydrate diet, surprise, surprise, you didn't store much carbohydrates. If you then had a high carbohydrate diet, you were able, after 3 days of eating, to store a lot more carbohydrate. Asked to ride at a fixed intensity, where these guys lasted 63 minutes. These guys up here went for 187. So if you're doing an activity that's going to go for a long time, you want to start with a good carbohydrate store. First piece of information. Second piece of vital information is, and I think I've shown you this already, is that the higher exercise intensity you go, carbohydrate provides more yield of energy, so that you need to shift, or your body will shift towards burning more carbs as a fuel. So what we're looking at here is that at 70% of VO2 max, if you're riding along, running along nice and steadily, you've probably got enough carbohydrate on board for around about 5 hours of exercise. Increase that exercise intensity just a small amount, up to 75%, and you've now come to about 3.5 hours. Coming up to about 80-85%, and you're under 2 hours. Now, if you start doing repeat sprints, in repeat sprints, you can strip out your glycogen store in 15 to 20 minutes. So if you're running cross country, if you're doing cyclocross, if you're mountain bike racing, that's sprint, recover, you can strip that glycogen out really, really quickly. Right, Chris, what sort of training would be? I will probably come to that one later on, Chris. So I will answer that one later on. Thanks. So Chris Better has just posted a question up, and as I say, if you've got questions, feel free to fire them along. I will come on to this afterwards, Chris, because I think it's more relevant later on than me covering it now. So really important for now is this exercise intensity has a major bearing. The higher the exercise intensity goes here, what we find is we strip out that glycogen, we run out of fuel far, far quicker. So next slide. As we move to the next slide, we then start looking at the impact of actually using carbohydrate during exercise. Now again, another classic study. These guys are exercising for 2.5 hours, and we can see in the red line here, blood glucose levels were dropping, and they continue to drop. At 2 hours 15, the guys were given a really strong, hideously strong, like 25% carbohydrate mix. They were probably chewing it rather than drinking it. But anyway, what happened as a result, blood sugar levels went up, plasma glucose levels went up. And as a result, in a fixed intensity trial, these guys were able to go for 21% longer. Now, the dogs are bugging me. I'm going to go kick them out for 2 seconds. Apologies. Right, out you go. Sorry, it's either animals or children, isn't it? So I'm back. So what we've got here is we have got a situation going on where as exercise intensity goes on, as exercise duration goes on at a fixed intensity, blood glucose levels continue to drop. However, a strong carbohydrate drink 2.25 hours in has then increased plasma carbohydrate levels, so blood sugar levels, and the exercise activity has gone on for 21% longer. Now, I used to question my students, and it's quite fun to sort of, if I'm doing this as a seminar, to ask questions as to why you think it's happening. Well, I'm not going to get feedback from you, so I'm going to tell you. The carbohydrate that's ingested goes into the stomach, into the gut, absorbed. We see an increase in blood sugar. Now, depending on the carbohydrate beverage you're using, whether you're using a solid, whether you're using a gel, whether you're using fluid, can be in the bloodstream in anything from 3 to 5 minutes for a really quick, simple sugar uptake. Fantastic. So we can actually get transfer into the blood, but then that's got to be pulled into the muscle to exercise. So what we're seeing in this case here is these guys were actually finishing the trial with still a high blood sugar level. So they've got their drink, they've downed their drink, and it's caused a spike in blood sugar, but that's not been able to transfer across to the muscle. Now, the other question I'd say is that, you don't want to get to the end of your marathon and be told, oh, you've been drinking sports drinks, therefore you've got to do 21% longer. So what we really should be looking at here is, could you pace a bit faster? Could you run a bit faster and actually run out of carbohydrate, run out of glycogen at the same point? So again, that's something that we need to think about later on. I've thrown this in really quickly. I don't want it to highlight on it, but then I thought afterwards, it's really crucial that we think about recovery post-exercise, and this is done in a couple of ways, but one of the things I wanted to highlight on here, and this is a classic paper. It wasn't actually a study that was done, but it's a classic paper that suggests that with repeated days exercise, so we see typical 2-hour training bouts, 24 hours apart, on a low carbohydrate diet, the athlete's carbohydrate levels continue to drop over 3 days of exercise. With a high carbohydrate diet, we'll see that drop in carbohydrate, but we'll see a pretty good restoration. And then we'll see a drop and we'll see a restoration. And if we look across, we can actually see by the end of that third bout, the athletes haven't restored, or by the end of the second day, 48 hours before the third bout, the athletes haven't restored back to where they were at the start. So you can't replenish all your glycogen. So it's really important to look at rest and recovery. Again, hence I'm talking about overtraining stimulus and all those sort of things in a fortnight's time. But just bear this in mind. We've got to have a good carbohydrate diet to ensure that we refuel if we're doing lots of endurance exercise. Then the other thing that I just wanted to touch upon here is that if you're exercising with a low carbohydrate diet because you're thinking, I want to lose weight, depending on what you're trying to achieve, often that low carbohydrate diet will see an increased protein breakdown. So at rest, we're always turning over protein, skin, hair, and those sort of things. Those of us who've got only just a little bit left, haven't had a shave tonight, apologies. We see as you exercise, that protein breakdown increases considerably. But if you try and exercise with low carbohydrate in the muscle, we're almost looking again at a 2.5-fold increase on your exercising protein breakdown. So it's really important, again, that we go into exercise well prepared for what we're doing for exercise. And then we've got fluid requirements. Now, I don't know how this is coming across on your screen. It's not the clearest on mine, so I do apologize for that. But what we're looking at rest, typically our fluid intake, so what we're drinking and I need to stay hydrated, is around about 60% of where we get our body from. Someone else just fired a question at me. Let me just have a quick look at what that is. What does protein break down and is it bad? Right, okay. So basically, Angus, and I think perfect time to answer that. Let me just flick back to that slide for you. So, right, so Angus has asked, what does protein breakdown do? And I've gone wrong way my slides. I want to go there. What does protein breakdown do and is it bad? So effectively what you're doing is all your muscles are protein. As I say, skin, hair, everything you're turning over is protein. The problem we've got is that if we start breaking down the muscle that we're trying to build, we're in a situation that we're actually going to regress, and we're going to push the body into too much of a negative situation. And so you're more likely to become injured, you're more likely to become ill. So again, too much protein breakdown, immune function gets suppressed, illness comes on. So the training you're trying to do is setting you backwards, you're trying to lose weight, and you'll be finding you're constantly injuring yourself, you're constantly getting niggles and things like that. Again, often related to either too low a protein breakdown or trying to train too hard with not enough carbohydrate on board. So the protein is effectively, it's the structure of everything that we've got in our body. And if we're breaking that down too fast, then we're breaking our cells down too fast. The body can't repair, you can't recover quickly enough. And the consequence of that is you end up ill or injured. So it's something you're trying to avoid. So again, the concept is you need to make sure you've got a decent protein intake. You've got to make sure you've got a decent carbohydrate intake in your diet. So hopefully that's answered that for you. Let me just flick. Come on. Sometimes my mouse doesn't want to work. There we are. Let's do that. And I can put you on the next slide. So as I said, I was coming on to looking at fluid. So at rest, typically fluid intake at rest is 60%. And we actually make about 30% of the fluid that we have in our body comes from the food that we eat. It's generally fairly moist. You don't go and eat bits of cardboard and stuff like that. So the more moist your food is, that's where you get it. And then there's this 10%, which is metabolic water production. So most of the places that we go, that we live, and even if my Nigerian friends and colleagues are online tonight, it's fairly high humidity, and what the air that you breathe in also gives the body some water. So that's where we get the water from. The problem is, as you exercise, as most of you will have noticed, you start to sweat. So perspire, sweat, that decreases your body water, which has a consequence of it decreases the plasma volume. As a result, we look and we see an increased heart rate because we are decreasing the stroke volume. So the amount of blood in the body is dropping, the amount of blood per beat of the body drops, and therefore we've got to increase heart rate to compensate. So when I'm looking at an athlete that's training and I'm seeing that they're doing a steady workload and it might be a steady power output, if I see the heart rate going up, that's usually a sign to me that they're not drinking enough, plasma volume's coming down, they're not cooling enough if they're indoors, or there could be some issues with they're not getting enough energy on board, and we'll explain that in a moment. So that's from a steady power output, or if they're doing a steady heart rate and we're seeing that their speed or their power is dropping, again, similar situation going on. If we're finding that the power is going down, and they say they're drinking well enough, then again, I'll then start to look and investigate whether there's enough carbohydrate on board coming on. Because if there's not enough carbohydrate available, we now need to start burning more fat as a fuel, as we showed you before. And to burn fat as a fuel, we then need to get more oxygen on board. So the oxygen uptake would go up as well. So whilst I don't have many people exercise with a gas analyzer on for extended periods of time, again, that's a sign and symptom that we're looking at to see that you're not on top of what's going on. So we see changes in what was described here as circulatory distress and postural hypertension. Basically, blood pressure shifts. You finish exercise, we then rehydrate and recover. We're not worried about water loss at rest, but that's what we're looking at there. So that's where we're losing our water from, and that's why it's important to us. And so what we're seeing is, how much can you lose? Well, Noakes suggested all the way back in 1993, and I did a PhD with him, and I questioned quite a lot of what he suggested, was that individuals can lose in excess of 2 litres per hour when exercising in hot, humid conditions. We subsequently went on to revise this and found out that actually the harder you exercise, the more likely you are to sweat. And even in a normal temperature environment, you can possibly still sweat quite a lot in terms of both body percentage sweat losses and body mass losses. So that was really important. Other suggestions have been a 1 to 2% decrease in weight loss through sweat loss can cause up to a 20% decrease in performance. Now, I think those numbers are a little bit on the high side, but really useful to know. Jane has just asked about postural hypertension. Does it mean that I'm dehydrated generally? So you should drink more if you can. And we're going to come on to that again in a little while, Jane. So we shall look at what I would recommend, and we'll look at strategies for how we compensate that. So hopefully I'll answer your question as we go along. So any problems, give me a shout when we come onto it in a moment. So effects of dehydration. And what we're seeing here is that if we look at the graph that we've got in front of us, that 100% performance, no dehydration. And as the dehydration level increases, we're looking at potential drops in performance away from maximum performance. And what they're suggesting here, 1 to 2% here, is we're really looking at a 5 to 10% drop in performance. So there will be a slight drop in performance. Louise has just answered, and I will answer that afterwards, Lou. Yeah, so immediately before and after a session, yes, I do, but we'll come on to that later. So I'm getting carried away. Sorry, I'm getting excited. So what we're looking at is this example suggests that a 1 to 2%. So there's 1% dehydration there. We're looking at just under 5%. There's 2% there. We're looking at about 10%. So that's still a substantial drop in potential performance. Now, again, there's some revised ideas about this. And, if you're running a marathon, you want to be as lean and light as possible. So actually performing at a certain level of dehydration might actually be good for overall performance. We can go in the other direction. You can get hypernatremia by drinking too much. So it's about finding a balance. It's about being sensible, and it's probably about making sure that you don't finish that exercise being too dehydrated. So it's just worthwhile having in the back of your mind, how long's my exercise? What am I doing? What's the impact? What's the impact on my body? Is it going to have an implication for how long it's going to take me to recover for the exercise that I'm doing? And this is a classic I don't need to. So this was a study I did all the way back in 2001 with Carrie Ann Bax, who was one of my PhD students at the time. I was teaching out of Kingston, and for some reason these have been overlaid for some strange reason. So what we're looking at is the black solid box is race 1 and the open box is race 2. So we looked at 2 different time trials. They were both fairly early season in, they were just outside Reading, I believe. I was down in Kingston at the time. And what we did is we weighed as many cyclists pre and post the 25-mile time trial as we're happy to weigh. One of the days, I think, was a sort of a relatively warm 19 degrees. And typical English weather, it was drizzling, and the other day was about 17, 18 degrees and not drizzling. And actually, between the temperature and the weather conditions, there wasn't that much of a difference. But what we see is in a 25-mile time trial, where the average rider time of the sample of, I think we sampled 75 or 80 cyclists, the average body mass lost in a 1 hour time trial was 1.25 kilos. And when we represent that as a sweat loss, we're looking at sweat losses of nearly 2%, with a variation. Some riders losing nearly 2.5 kilos, 2.5 liters of sweat loss. And as percentage body mass change, if we look at that on the right hand side of the screen here, we're seeing on average a 2% body mass drop. So substantial drops in just the 1 hour time trial. So again, if we go back to our previous slide here, these guys here were only at 90% of their optimal capacity at the back end of a 25-mile time trial. So, you then double this and go, it's a 50-mile time trial. Where are we going to be on this scale? And I've seen, I've been working in a professional football environment, and in an hour and a half of training where the guys are doing repeat sprints, it's not been unusual for me to see players drop, and you wouldn't believe it, 3 to 4 kilos from the start to the end of an hour and a half training session. Because shirts are dripping in sweat, they're just not drinking enough, and they're just exercising on a day like it's been today. It's sort of 24, 25 degrees outside. And it probably doesn't help that they weren't the best cardiovascular fit athletes, but these were premiership football players. So you need to at least think about it. You need to see how it impacts. So basically it comes on to us thinking about, what do you need for performance? And this is really what I want to focus on this evening. I've taken far too much time already. So the crucial bits you've learned, but this is the practicalities of it. So replacement of fluid loss through sweating is paramount. That's the first thing in my mind. That in the short term has the biggest impact on performance. The problem is if you run out of glycogen, you're stuffed, you're not going anywhere. Whereas you can be dehydrated and you'll carry on, but you'll just continue to get slower and slower and slower. So, glycogen is, running out of glycogen is the brakes have gone on, you've hit the wall, whatever you want to call it, you've bonked. It's catastrophic. Whereas sweat loss isn't catastrophic, but actually see massive, bigger detriments in performance. So really what we've got to do is we've got to assess different weather conditions, different climatic conditions, different race types, different terrains, whether you're running, whether you're cycling, and so on and so forth. We also know that carbohydrate utilization increases significantly as a result of exercise. So you've got to think, right, I've got to get the carbs on board as well as the fluid on board. One thing I've not talked about, and I don't really want to touch on tonight, is that undertaking exercise doesn't significantly increase the body's requirement for micronutrients. So your sodiums, your potassiums in your drinks generally make the drink taste much better. So they'll be more palatable, you're more likely to consume them. But again, there's evidence out there that suggests that up to about 2 to 3 hours of exercise, they aren't essential. Now, I know the guys from Precision Hydration and what have you will be jumping up and down and going, there will be people out there that require quite a lot of salt. But most of us have got more than enough salt stored in our body as it presently is. And actually, the first meal post-exercise is going to replace everything that you've lost during exercise. Now, there will be people that suffer chronically from cramps. Okay, are you drinking enough firstly? Now, it might be that you've had a sodium tablet with your drink pre-exercise. Great, that's just made you better hydrated, so the level of dehydration isn't so substantial before you when you finish the exercise, hence you're not getting cramp. It might be that you're just not getting enough carbohydrate on board. We're all too quick to pop a tablet, and I do, and I'll take vitamins, I'll take minerals when it's right. I will use salt tablets when I think it's right, when I know I can't over a 40-minute or an hour and a quarter exercise get a huge amount of fluid in, so I will put that salt tablet in as a protection, but it's not essential. So again, it's play around with things and find what works for you. The benefits of your sports drink are they replace your sweat loss, they offset the carbohydrate depletion that you're seeing going on during exercise, and post-exercise, primarily, they replenish your carbohydrate stores. So it's really important that we use them for those things and those factors. When we're drinking, I'm not going to take another drink because I've been talking too much. The primary factor that affects fluid absorption, so from that drink that you're drinking, is the exercise type. So if I'm running and my stomach is bouncing up and down, I cannot empty as much fluid as if I'm sat on my bike and my body's going nowhere. So if I'm sat here and my legs are going 100 miles an hour, you don't know. If I'm running, I'm bouncing up and down, and so my stomach is. So that's the primary impact on how much fluid you can absorb. I've seen nasogastric tube up the nose into the stomach. I've seen people empty 2 to 3 litres of fluid per hour, where I've done trials where we've looked at the impact of drinking and how you can absorb and exercise intensity. And it was all the stuff I was doing associated and allied to my PhD back in Cape Town many years ago. And the stuff we got away with, right, drink this, I'm going to suck it back out of your stomach. Oh, that's how much you've still got in there. And you can see massive difference. So, depending on the athlete's size, a cyclist can drink 2 to 3 litres an hour and actually absorb that. A runner is more likely to be between 1.2 and 1.6 litres an hour if you've trained to do it. If you're not trained to do it, you're going to struggle with a litre. You're going to struggle with 500 mils. So it's about what the exercise type is and getting your body used to doing it. The next thing is fluid volume. If you've got big volume of fluid, you go glug, 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 you end up filling the stomach. If you don't drink again for another hour, initially you're going to get quite a good pressure head where the fluid is forced in to the stomach and it's then forced to be emptied. Whereas what we need to be doing is we need to be sipping consistently. So big volume of fluid will empty rapidly, and then the emptying rate slows and slows and slows and slows until we throw in the next big volume, but it doesn't feel comfortable. So we keep topping that up. So those are the primary factors that we look at. There are secondary factors. Drinks that are cooled are shown to be better absorbed. There's questions about whether osmolality plays a balance or not, and some people suggest it does, other people say it doesn't. Electrolytes make a drink more palatable. Caffeine can actually make you dehydrated. So again, using caffeine tablets to use that caffeine shots and that hit can actually make you dehydrated. So we've got to look at these, but actually these factors here are massively overweighed by what's going on up here. So I don't worry about them quite so much. We also know, and I showed you that slide before where we were seeing blood sugar levels continue to drop versus blood sugar staying high, and actually exercise finishing with high blood sugar levels, is that during exercise, any drink that you consume with carbohydrate on board, that carbohydrate can be taken up and used by the working muscle at a maximum rate of around about 1 gram per minute. So for most of us, we want about 60 grams an hour of carbohydrate. Now, again, we can scale. If I've got a 100-kilo cyclist, they've got lots of legs on them, they've got lots of muscle on them, they can probably get 80 to 100 grams of carbohydrate in them. If I've got a 40-kilo female rider, there's no way you're going to put 60 to 80 grams of carbohydrate in, because what happens, you put too much carbohydrate in, if it's not absorbed, it gets into the lower intestine and the bacteria go mad and you end up with explosive diarrhea, which is why you don't go into a toilet if you can help it in Ironman, because don't race in white shorts with Ironman Mark Talon if you're still on. So anyway, so those are the things we've got to think about. Without an optimal replacement strategy, as we saw before, it can take at least 48 hours to replenish depleted muscle carbohydrate stores. So we want to think about replenishing that carbohydrate. So again, what we're doing in our diet can be really vital. But what we're thinking about is what's going on before, during, and afterwards. And that's all I'm looking at tonight, because otherwise I am going to be here all night. Typically, about 4 hours before exercise, you'd have a normal size meal. Now, what that means for you is entirely up to you. And it also means that if you're training at 6 o'clock in the morning or 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, as my Nigerians do, you don't get up at midnight and eat. This is your meal the night before. So that's if you're doing a morning session. Ideally, if you need it, if you haven't had that meal before, or if you still feel you need a snack, it would be a light snack, 50 to 80 grams of carbohydrate if required, about 2 hours before. And then from 2 hours right up to exercise, I'd avoid solid food, because it's going to sit heavy in the stomach. And when it comes to exercise, you're then going to need to divert food into the stomach. Now, again, some people think it's worth eating the last 30 minutes. I don't. I'm against it. But it's personal preference. And it might actually be, if you're doing an ultra distance race, having something 20 to 30 minutes before that's a low or a slow breakdown of digestion is actually starting to put the glycogen on board. But again, it's everybody's different, each different case for each individual. Pre-exercise fluid intake about 2 hours before, I would suggest, again, depending on your body size, depending on what you're doing, practicing and training, but having somewhere between 400 and 600 mils of fluid. Now, you could have that with your carbohydrate if needed. So I can hear Becky's rattling around out there somewhere. So her little trick, or my little trick for her, was that she's terrible at having breakfast. So when we're racing a triathlon at 7 o'clock in the morning or 7:30 in the morning, she'll have a mug of tea. So I'll make her a really big mug of tea, and I'd stick 40 grams of carbohydrate powder in it, and she'd drink her mug of tea, and she was quite happy with just having that mug of tea, but she'd have, 300, 400 mils of fluid with a mug of tea, but she'd have 40 or 50 grams of carbohydrate in it without even thinking that she was eating, because she couldn't face eating. So, we can do that in order to get the carbs in if we need pre a race situation. Again, wouldn't suggest it in training, but this is where we're trying to top up if we need to. Immediately prior to exercise, then, as I was saying to you before about keeping the stomach topped up, we would have probably 200 to 400 mils of fluid. But again, it's getting used to doing this. So if you try this before, and you won't be racing at the weekend, but if you try this before a race, for the first time ever, you watch this on a Wednesday night, in a month, 3 months time, and you've got a race at the weekend, I'll try that. And you drink 300 mils of fluid on the start line, you're going to be bloated. It's going to be bouncing around. Get used to doing this in training. Get your body used to doing this. With that, we'd have a small carbohydrate solution. So 10 to probably 40 grams of carbs, depending on your body size, depending on what you're trying to achieve, depending on what you're doing. If then you're training for less than 1 hour, I would say to you, fluid and carbohydrates might be beneficial. It's not essential for the training session you're doing, but actually what it's doing is it's offsetting the dehydration that you're going to occur during the training session, and it's offsetting some of the carbohydrates. So it's going to help you recover faster afterwards. If you're training for more than 1 hour, I would say to you, you want small, regular feedings of carbohydrate. And I'll probably tell you this in a slide or two's time, probably looking at every 5 to 15 minutes that you're supping on drink if you can. If you're running, it's taking a gel with you and having that gel every 20 to 30 minutes. And ideally, we're looking for between 0.75 and 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilogram of body mass per hour. So if you're going out for a 3-hour training session and you're 80 kilos, you're probably having 80 grams of carbs each of those 3 hours and breaking that down to maybe having 20 grams of carbs every 15 minutes. So it's a gel every 15 minutes. That certainly would be a race strategy for you. In training, you might only have 15 grams or 10 grams. So again, it's practicing, it's finding what works, it's finding what I cope with. If I'm at a training intensity or if I'm at race intensity, how much carbs can I have? Does it give me stomach upset? How do I cope with that? And then we need to look at how much you're sweating. So you want that moderate balance. You want to have enough fluid to try and offset as much sweat loss as possible without actually going fluid overload and without actually ending up dehydrated. So I think at this point, this is where Louise wanted me to mention. So what I tend to suggest to people, in an ideal world, do this in training, do it in a variety of different environments. Jump on the scales before you exercise. Now, in an ideal world, you jump on the scales naked, measure your weight, write that down, go out and train. Remember to get dressed, because otherwise you'll get arrested or you'll get bloody cold. You come back, you take your wet, sweaty clothes off, you towel yourself down as best as possible, you get back on the scales. You know what the weight loss is. You do it in kilos, because every kilo is worth a litre of sweat loss. And I do think I'm now going to tell you this in a moment. But every kilo you've lost is worth a litre of sweat that you've lost. So we need to replenish that sweat loss. Do it in different environments, do it on warm days, do it in cold days, do it when training indoors, do it when training outdoors, do it for interval sessions, do it for long steady rides, do it for group rides. So you know what your sweat loss is on a range of different environmental conditions, on a range of different exercise intensities. And then ideally, if you're training for more than an hour, ideally you're looking at drinking 100 to 150 mils. So even at the lowest end, we're only looking at 600 to 800 mils of fluid every 10 to 15 minutes with a small carbohydrate concentration, 5 to 10%, again, depending on body size and body scale. Most importantly, so if you've got my book, which I should really be showing you now, but I haven't got one in front of me, there's got to be one somewhere around here, I won't find it. I actually talk about nutrition for training, and that's the first of the nutrition chapters, because for me, this is the most important thing. But as I say, tonight was the last 4 or 5 slides are really important for some of my guys that haven't been quite doing it right and need to make those little tweaks. Eating for recovery is essential, and glycogen synthase is the enzyme that puts the carbohydrate back in the muscle. The muscle activity is really high for about 2 hours after exercise. And so what we want is something between 75 and 150 grams of carbs within 15 minutes. Now, again, let's be sensible. If you've done a 30-minute recovery session, you don't need anywhere near that much. If you've gone out and beasted yourself for 4 hours, you need that much. So be sensible with what you're putting on into your body. You know, think about the session, think about the exercise intensity. For the guys that I work with, I'm more than happy to give you some tips and pointers and go, this is a hard one. How much more carbs do we need? That's an easy one. You don't need to worry about it. If I don't coach you, then talk to me about coaching, or talk to me about booking a test with me, and we can give you a lot more of this specific information. Ideally, alongside of that, we want 15 to 20 grams of protein. So as we were asked before, that protein, we will get protein breakdown during exercise. That protein breakdown will help, the protein in your post-exercise recovery will help with the resynthesis. It will help with the rebuilding of the muscle. It also helps absorb some of the carbohydrates. And then you want to rehydrate. And at this point here, you want to rehydrate at least 25% more than the body mass lost. So again, it's that, how much have you lost in this training session? Right, and you need to drink 25% more than that, because some of this is going to be filtered by the kidneys and it's going to come out as pee. It's going to come out as urine. So we've got to drink at least 25% more than the body mass you lost. So if you've lost a kilo, you need to drink 1.25 litres to 1.5 litres in order to replenish what we need, Ed. If you're weighing before and after a session, yes, you do. So that's absolutely spot on. Thanks, Ed. Ed Bolland's just reminded me, if we're weighing ourselves before and after a session, should we factor in fluid intake during exercise? Yes. Now, we should, but there's 2 things, Ed, we've got to look at. So it's worthwhile if you factored in how many bottles or how many litres, how many millilitres of fluid you've consumed during that session, because this tells us a little bit more. It not only tells us, so the simple method of weigh pre-post is saying to us, right, this is what you've lost. This is how much more you potentially should have consumed. So that's a very useful factor. So we know, right, this is what we've got to drink post-exercise. But what you're also suggesting here is that if you also made a note of, I've done a 2-hour ride or a 2-hour run, and I've drunk 1 litre and I've come back and I'm still a kilo down, right, okay, that's meant my sweat loss during that exercise was 2 litres an hour. 2 litres or 1 litre an hour instead of, so I need to drink that much more. So again, it factors in that if you then are going out as a cyclist or a triathlete and now doing a 3 or a 4 hour session, you know what your sweat rate is, so you then can adjust your fluid rate accordingly. So that's taking it to another level of actually saying you can now start to target what your fluid intakes should be during training sessions as well as during exercise. So as well as post-exercise. So that for me is eating for recovery. So those are the bits I wanted to cover. Just asking, are you getting it right? You know, because sometimes you get it wrong, it hurts. Sometimes you get it right and it hurts. Key things that I've spoken about tonight, and I'm coming on to 55 minutes, so I've been talking too long. Practice in training. As an individual, everybody is slightly different. Find out what works for you. Find out your optimal nutrition strategy for both training and competition. In summary, fluid and carbohydrate are essential during training competition. Don't overlook them. Practice what you're going to do in competition during training. So when you turn up on competition day, and I worked for one of the sports nutrition companies at London Marathon many years ago, and on the Thursday, Friday and Saturday pre-marathon, people are coming along and buying gels and trying them on the stand for the first time, go, oh, this tastes quite nice, I'll have one of these on Sunday. It's quite low. It's not what you want to do, but anyway, so practice in training to find what works for you. Carbohydrate is needed immediately post-exercise, and if you decide not to have anything before or during, have some carbohydrate immediately post. It doesn't need to be at this point a sports drink, it just needs to be carbohydrate. If it's broken down easily and it's not mixed, then it's great, but it's thinking about getting that carbohydrate in as soon as you possibly can. Different nights, completely different talk, completely looking at optimal weight and looking at how we consider that with focused training. And obviously that's something I can help you with over here at Sportstest. And what we can do then is nutritional analysis, body fat percentage, sporting dietary requirements. We can look at your physiological assessment, so we can look at your VO2 max, your heart rate max, training zones, power zones. Now, more importantly is that efficiency, what rate you're burning fat, what rate you're burning carbohydrates, and how economical you are in both of those, and then truly knowing where your threshold is from a metabolic point of view rather for an FTP point of view. Go back and listen to what I spoke about for 45 minutes 2 weeks ago and get a much clearer understanding of what your body does as opposed to guess those values. Help your training program design and coaching. So thank you. I've covered far more than I've covered what I wanted to, but I've taken me far more than I should have done. For those of you that have enjoyed it, and we're going to get some questions now, which is great. For those of you who enjoyed it, I've just got a little link up there at the bottom, coffee. So coffee.com, hop over to coffee and buy me a coffee if you thought that was great. Angus, what carbohydrate snacks, things do you recommend for exercise? Most gels only have 22 grams of carbohydrates per sachet, so it's working what works for you. You know, I prefer you know, so I will use gels in training. What I tend to do is I'm just getting questions. I'm just going to check and see whether there's anything on the chat forum. I'm going to put two things up at once. No, chat forum looks quiet tonight, so I can bin that off. No, I can't bin it off, that's fine. So what would I use? It depends on what I'm doing, Angus. And if I go back to sort of, I can't remember, was it 3 summers ago, where I rode 8 days of the Tour de France route with Le Loop, and then 4 or 5 weeks later went and did Haute route. A lot of that training there was what I'd say was with real food. You know, I was going out with pieces of cake, I was going out with snacks in my back pocket, just thing like just chew on and eat nice and easily. And I was surviving on real food. When you're coming down and you're racing and it's short and it's sharp and intense, then that's where I really look at things like the gels. But for me, even when I'm racing stuff like Ironman, I primarily focus on fluid. So I will look at my fluid intake, and then I will put in my fluid intake, I will put powder. Now, again, there are some manufacturers out there, and I work quite closely at times with Stealth. they produce a pure carbohydrate powder. It's got no additives, no colorants, no flavorants in it. Now, people say it's a bit bland, but then you put a low-calorie fruit drink in to give it a bit of a flavor. You stick some salt in there if you need it, or you mix it with one of their salt-based solutions, and you can make that as strong or as weak as you need to. So you can go out, and I'll quite often go out, in the winter, with an 800ml bottle with 120 grams of carbohydrate in it, knowing that one bottle is going to last me a 2-hour ride in the winter because I'm not sweating lots. In the summer, I'm going to have that 800ml bottle every 30 minutes. So, I only want 30 grams of carbs in that bottle. So again, I can make it, nice and easy. So it's testing the market. It's finding what works for you. I've tried all sorts of stuff. I've tried shot blocks. I've tried, all sorts of things. At the end of the day, it's what you like. It's what works for you. So hopefully that helps you out. Mike, thank you very much. I hope you found that useful. Mark, good, it's got you through T. Yeah, love to see you again soon. Hopefully, it's a really difficult one about how soon it's going to be before I get people in the lab. Having more discussions today. I am hoping it's going to be July, but it might only be August or September, and it's a real dilemma about, whether I turn up head to toe, gowned in PPE because people are desperate to come and see me, or whether I think that's a bit much. And, so I've just got to, I've got to look at all the risk assessments and everything else. So, but there's also some exciting news coming up that we hopefully will tell you about in the next week or two. Dan, tonight wasn't about caffeine or ergogenic aids or anything else like that, but we will possibly cover that on another session for you. Jane, learn loads, drink more, really important, drink more. Try that before and after weighing. It really opens your eyes to how much, how much hydration levels shift. It's worthwhile as the day goes on, and I haven't, it's not really appropriate. I haven't mentioned it today, but again, you type in Armstrong P charts and you will find on Tinterweb, and I can't remember if I think we put one in my running book, but not in the cycling book. So have a look at Armstrong P charts. And that will give you an understanding of looking at your urine to see how well hydrated or dehydrated you are. I've got another little device that you pee into a pot and you bottom it on and you look through it, and that looks at specific gravity of your urine. So again, we get a much better understanding of where you are. I keep diverting Chris, right, apologies. So Chris asked all the way back, and he's reminding me, training to improve pace or power when fat burning. It is all about going slow, and keeping on going slow. And it's about knowing that level, that intensity of what we've got to do. So it's that endurance level or potentially just below that endurance level. And as you get fitter and stronger from doing that endurance work, Chris, you will find that your fat metabolism should increase. And so I've just got some stuff coming up on the chat as well. So you should find, you only go slow at the moment, that's fine. You will find that your pace will increase, your fat metabolism will increase as your efficiency gets better and gets stronger. So it is, honestly, it's keep going slow, keep it going. Throw in a faster session. Again, today isn't about fat burning. Today's not about weight loss. So I'll come back and I'll do a session in 4, 6, 8 weeks time about weight loss, about looking at fasted sessions, looking about sleeping low, training low in the morning, doing all of those sort of things. But at the moment, to improve your pace and power and fat burning, just keep it slow. Mix your intensities, do your endurance stuff. You've had enough sessions from me. You should know what you're up to. But if you need to, feel free to give me a shout. We'll spend 20 minutes on a call together. More than happy to do that. Martin, looking forward to getting back in the lab. No problems at all. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. Okay, I think that's all my questions answered. IB from Nigeria, great to see you, thank you. I saw your message, I couldn't reply that you couldn't get on, apologies. Mike, dextrose powder. Again, it's what works for you. Dextrose is very, very simple, and it can create insulin spikes and then drop-offs again, but as you're exercising, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. And it is what works for you, and that's the crucial thing. Sometimes with sucroses and dextroses, because they're very simple sugars, you'll find you get very sticky, very, very dry lips, and you don't like it. And it's sometimes quite nice to have that hit of sugar, which is then released naturally over the next 10-15 minutes before you have that next hit of sugar. But as I say, it's working what works for you. So guys, that looks like everything. We finished on 1 hour and 5. I think we've done quite well. Thank you again for all of your time and attention. As I say, with a bit of luck, this will be going on YouTube. I know Joe will be working on this tonight and tomorrow. It took weeks to upload last week, so it will probably be on at some time tomorrow in the day, tomorrow night. I'll be cheeky again. There's a few people that have already been online and supported me and bought me a little coffee. So I really appreciate you coming along and supporting, guys. Don't feel that you need to, but it's nice. Just as a little mention, I'm not sure when we will be starting testing. I will let people know as soon as possible. I have said to a few people, and I will make it known, I will first of all invite my VIP coaching clients in for testing first to get the first dibs in my diary. Then anyone that has booked and paid for a gift voucher of any sort over the past 2 or 3 months, they will get the next hit in my diary, and after that the diary will go open to everybody. So if you want to book in and come and see me for a test as soon as I can open up, and you want to get first dibs, either sign up for coaching or make sure you booked yourself a gift voucher. On to next week. Next week we will be talking about overtraining, rest recovery, overtraining symptoms, and how to avoid them. If you have anything you would like me to talk about, please let me know. In the YouTube bit, stick it in the comments. If you like this, share it with your friends, tell them all how wonderful I am, and thank you all for your time this evening. Good night, everybody.